Tonight's fairy tale has something for everyone. Are you a dog person? It's got something for you. Are you a cat person? It's got something for you. Do you hate animals? Get out. I'm sharing The White Cat by Madame Delnoy tonight on
Fucked Up Fairy Tales with Liz.
Ding! Which continues our celebration of the women of fairy tale history. Once upon a time, there was a king who had 3 sons, all of them incredibly brave and clever. So much so that the old king began to worry that they'd want to usurp the throne before he was ready to give it up. He thought the best way to keep them from revolting was to keep them busy. So he set them on a series of bizarre quests. Boys, find me the prettiest, most faithful little dog you can, to become my companion after retirement. Whoever finds the most beautiful pup will be the one to succeed me. The young men were given a year to track down the most goodest boy. Our story follows the youngest prince. Now, at the top of our tale, our youngest prince is definitely a dog person, because not a day had passed in his quest before he'd already found several viable contenders. As soon as he'd bought one dog thinking he'd found the prettiest one, he'd be selling it off again upon seeing a new dog, because he found them all to be equally tops in his heart. Aren't you a good boy and the prettiest little dog you ever did see? Oh, aren't you the best little pup this side of the Seine? Oh, lordy, it a floof. Good golly, I cannot resist a corgi butt. It went like this through 40,000 dogs. It was at this point in his travels that the prince found himself in a very gloomy part of the forest. And worse, a thunderstorm had found him. He wandered through the wood until he saw a light through the trees. The light belonged to the most incredible castle he had ever laid eyes on. The door was covered in red garnets. The walls were porcelain and painted with all the illustrations of all the stories the prince had ever read. The rain was coming down in sheets, so the prince hurried to the door and rang the bell. The door of the palace opened to reveal a grand entryway that was empty, but for 1,000 disembodied hands holding torches. The hands jostled him inside like he was in a mosh pit, and the prince let himself get carried along, though he did keep his own hand on his sword. Then he heard a disembodied voice reassure him that they meant no harm, and the hands got him some dry clothes, set him up in a bedroom decorated with butterfly wings, and waited on him hand and hand. They sat the prince down at a table set for 2. Suddenly, an orchestra of cats marched in. They were playing guitars and meow singing. A tiny figure in a dramatic black veil walked in, accompanied by a promenade of cats in capes with swords. The veiled creature threw back its shroud to reveal the prettiest little white cat you could ever imagine.
Welcome, my prince. I am the Queen of Cats. Silence the music, please. It is nonsense to the prince's ears. Let us dine. A roast squab for you, and a fricassee of mice for me.
Thank you. What a beautiful bracelet you wear on your paw. May I see it?
Certainly. It contains a portrait in the locket.
Wow, this picture looks a lot like me. Yes, it does. Thus began the prince's extended stay at the White Cat's palace. He enjoyed a cat theater troupe, he attended hunting parties on a sentient wooden horse, and he stayed with the White Cat for the rest of the year. Because the White Cat roofied him, so he forgot about everything else. That's not very ethical, ma'am. One day, the White Cat announced,
You only have 3 days left to find a pretty little dog for your father, you know.
Oh, my lordy, how could I have forgotten that?
Don't vex yourself. The wooden horse can get you home in half a day's time, and you can bring this.
An acorn?
Inside the acorn is the most beautiful dog in all the universe.
Wow! I only wish I could take you with me, too. I've had such a wonderful time here with you.
I'm afraid that cannot be. Good luck to you, my prince.
All 3 princes arrived home together. The elder boys had brought home some very sweet little dogs. But when the youngest produced the acorn from his coat and opened the lid, everyone saw that there was no contest. Inside was the tiniest dog you ever saw, and it did a little dance for everyone. Woof! Still, the king wasn't ready to give up his throne just yet. You know I obviously gave you much too easy a task last time. So here's a toughie. You have 1 year to find me a piece of muslin so fine it can pass through the eye of a needle. The elder brothers were very happy to get a second chance at the throne, and the youngest brother was happy to get another vacation at Cat Castle. So they all set out.
You came back!
Of course I came back. You're my best cat gal. I could also use a little help with my father's new task. A piece of muslin so fine it can pass through the eye of a needle.
Well, I do have some of the best spinners in the land. You know us cats, we love our fiber arts. We love playing with yarn, eating yarn, throwing it back up again. And the cats here can spin, too.
How'd you get to be so wise and worldly?
You may guess whatever you like, my prince, but my past must stay a secret.
How can I thank you for all you've done for me? You've treated me so well that if you asked of it, I would give up my kingship and never leave your side.
Sweet silly thing, give up the throne for a mere pet? Let's get you some magic fabric.
A year passed swiftly, full of more adventures than I could list. But finally it was time for the prince to return home with his super thin cotton. Much as before, the older brothers did procure some very fine muslin. But the youngest prince stole the show. He produced a walnut that the white cat said would contain his prize. He cracked that open, and inside was a hazelnut. Inside that was a cherry stone. Inside that was a kernel. And inside that was a millet seed. Oh, white cat, is this a big joke? As soon as he expressed his doubt aloud, the prince felt a phantom scratch at his hand, as if the white cat were admonishing him from afar. And so he cracked open that millet seed, and out unrolled a piece of muslin 200 yards long. It passed through the tiny needle with no problem. One more challenge. Come on, Dad. Well, every king should have a queen. I challenge you to find the loveliest princess in the land. Whoever brings her back shall win the throne. No more delay, no take-backsies. I have clearly won this thing. But you know what? I don't care. I got better places to be. This time when the prince returned, the white cat was waiting for him.
So I hear we have to find you a beautiful princess.
Another year passed in a whirlwind, full of flights and fancy and I assume a lot of scritches. And before long, the prince was due home with his beautiful princess.
All right, my prince, I have the most beautiful bride for you. But in order to escort her home, you must do exactly as I demand. Do you promise?
Of course I promise.
Take this sword.
Uh-huh.
And cut off my head.
What? No!
But you must!
I refuse.
You promised.
Please don't make me.
Do it!
With a trembling hand, the prince did as was asked of him. And as soon as the dread deed was done, the cat disappeared, and a gorgeous princess stood before him. Then all the doors around them opened, and in flooded a bunch of ladies and knights, each carrying a cat skin. They rushed up to the princess and began congratulating her.
My prince, it's finally time for me to unload my origin story. So my mother had a passion for traveling, and one trip she found herself in the land of the fairies. She wanted to try the famed fruits from their garden, and she did everything she could to try to sneak herself some. Finally, the fairies were so sick of my mother's attempts at thievery, they approached her.
Listen, bitch, we know you're trying to get a hold of our magic fairy fruits, but there is a price for that. And as payment, we want to raise your daughter.
No, I refuse! I'll give you anything else, a kingdom?
No deal. But I can assure you that she'll be very happy here, and you can see her when she's grown. Well, I will definitely die if I don't try one of those fruits. And a motherless girl would be much worse off than a girl raised by fairies, so let's do it. Your mom gave you away for fruit?
I mean, it was for the best fruit in the world.
Aw, honey.
And later she tried to renege on the promise.
But then my father found out she'd promised me away, and he locked her in a tower. And then the fairies sent a dragon to destroy our kingdom and eat anyone in the way. So finally my father just let the fairies take me to stop the carnage. Wow. So the fairies took me away in a chariot of pearl drawn by seahorses. On land? And they put me up in a beautiful tower of my own. The bummer was I had no friends except for a parrot and a dog, and they could talk, but they also cleaned their own assholes with their mouths, so, you know. By the time I hit puberty, I was very lonely and very vulnerable. A handsome prince found my tower, and we fell in love, like you do. He tried to help me escape, but the fairies caught us, and they sent that dragon back to maul him right in front of my eyes. So as my punishment for trying to leave, they turned me and my family into cats. And anyone lower than us, they just turned into disembodied hands. You seem to be handling a lot of crazy shit really well. Oh, I see the best therapist.
Remember Mittens, the ginger cat? He's the court psychologist.
Oh yeah, he threw up in my shoe once. Oh my god, that is so Dr. Mittens. Anyway, the fairies told me I could only regain my human form if I found a prince to fall in love with me who looked exactly like my former lover. That's so specific. I know, I'm really lucky you came along and that you fell in love with me. Oh god. I'm just realizing I fell in love with a cat. I'm gonna need an appointment with that Dr. Mittens. The brothers all returned to their father's house, the eldest with their princesses, and the youngest seemingly alone. Why did I think this would be a hard challenge? There are so many beautiful women in the world! Alright, time for me to pack it up and judge these women against each other Miss Universe style. Wait, youngest son, where is your princess? I actually brought home a cat. The prince gestured to a crystal chair that had a silk curtain drawn about it. The king reached out, but the moment his fingers brushed the curtain, the chair exploded into glitter dust, and the princess, formerly known as Cat, stood before him in all her glory. Damn it, you are so fucking pretty! I guess it's my time to abdicate. I'm so sad!
Your Highness, there's no need to deprive yourself of your throne. I have 6 kingdoms of my own already. Let me bestow one upon you and upon each of your sons. You get a kingdom, and you get a kingdom, and you get a kingdom. Everybody gets a kingdom, and I still have 3 left for me and my prince. That's the thing about rich people. We can give it all away and still keep getting richer. Someone should do something about that. Anyway, viva la France, right? The princes enjoyed a triple wedding, and everyone settled into their kingdoms and lived happily ever after. The end. A woman invented the term fairy tales. And yet, when we think of fairy tales, I bet some of the first names to pop into your head are Walt Disney, or Hans Christian Andersen, or the Brothers Grimm. But you have Madame Delnoy to thank for that. Madame Delnoy lived from 1650 to 1705. She wrote 25 literary fairy tales over the course of her life. And while we don't know a lot about her life, what we do know is pretty dramatic. She was married as a teenager to a man 30 years her senior. And while some people think this is really common for that era, it's actually not. It was more common for the aristocracy, but it was still pretty traumatic for her. So traumatic that she eventually conspired with her mother to kill her husband. There's also some word that she conspired with 2 of her lovers to make her husband to appear to be a traitor. She didn't like the guy. She was arrested, but her role couldn't be proven in it, and eventually she was released. And by the time the 2 of them became estranged, she was living in a salon in Paris and writing up a storm. Now, she wrote these fairy tales, and they were not intended for children. In fact, a lot of the older English adaptations, like the one I just shared by Andrew Lang, are revised for a child audience. But lucky for us, there is a newish translation of her work from 2019, translated from a feminist point of view and for an adult audience. And I fucking can't wait to get my hands on it. In addition to the White Cat, which I just shared here on TikTok, she wrote tales such as Cunning Cinders. Yes, she has a clever Cinderella story. The Story of Pretty Goldilocks, which has nothing to do with bears and which I'm sharing over on Patreon. A bunch of animal bridegroom and bride fairy tales, if that's your thing. You like frogs? She's got a Frog King type tale. And her fairy tales were so popular during her time that they would get around and read them, and people would cosplay as fairy tale characters at her salons. It's a real bummer to me that the most famous French fairy tale person is Charles Perrault. Even though they were operating in slightly different worlds, with him sharing folk tales that had been passed down over the years, and her creating her own fairy tales, which often seem to be inspired by folklore. In her tales, the most powerful beings are often wise women and fairies. Her views against forced marriage come through in these tales, and the male heroes in her tales often show a lot more respect for the women that they love than we see in a lot of these old folk tales. If you want to check out more of her work, you can, of course, revisit the Andrew Lang Fairy books, as he did share a lot of her stories there. Or you could track down The Island of Happiness for a fresher look at her stories. Or if you could track down a copy of Beauty's Beasts and Enchantment, Classic French Fairy Tales by Jack Zipes, he has a bunch of her stories in there as well. And I really recommend you do, because I could not fit the level of detail this woman put in her stories. For example, in The White Cat that I told, when they go out hunting, the White Cat rides a monkey who climbs trees to catch her baby birds.
Check out Madame's stories.